Chapter 9. An hour later. As she walked to the creek after her cold dinner of salad and crackers, a cup of tea in her hand, she pondered how she would have known the stove wasn't working properly if Mac hadn't tried. There really wasn't any way to know, unless she understood the workings of a stove. He told her not to turn it on again until she had somebody come and check it out. She had frowned. "I don't have money to fix that." He gave her a harsh look. "And you don't have the money if this thing blows up. It's ancient. None of the lighters work, and I wouldn't trust the gas either. It comes on too strong too fast. It probably just needs to be checked out. Don't worry about it. The repairman is a friend of mine. I don't think he'll charge you very much." Her gut clenched at the "not very much." That was relative. It varied from person to person, but in her case there really was no variance. Any money was too much money. She stood at the creek for a long moment, unsettled. And then thought of Nan. Doreen hadn't seen Nan today. Buoyed at the thought of seeing her grandmother and hearing Nan's quirky stories, Doreen pulled out her cell phone and called her. "Hey Nan. Have you had dinner?" "I sure have. Are you coming to visit me and have a cup of tea?" Nan invited her over. She stared at the tea in her hand and smiled. "Absolutely. You okay if I bring the animals?" "I'd be heartbroken if you didn't," Nan declared. With that, Doreen left her chipped teacup on a nearby rock, crossed over the creek on the bridge, Muggs and Goliath moving ahead of her, and Thaddeus, being stubborn, waddling behind. She led her menagerie down the opposite side of the creek toward Nan's place. It was a bit of a roundabout way, but it was much nicer than going through town. Not that Nan lived very far away. This route just tacked on 5 minutes. But it was 5 minutes along the creek, so who could argue with that? She passed the spot and tried not to look where she'd found the dead man last week. It was hard to believe it had only been a handful of days ago. "Come on, Muggs," she called out to the basset hound, who dragged his nose along the ground as he appeared to sniff every critter's scent that might have gone this way. He was a good guard dog. But more than that, he was a wonderful companion. He'd helped her keep her sanity when her marriage had splintered. Who'd have thought that this pet would be such a comfort to her? She turned to look at Thaddeus and frowned. "Thaddeus? Thaddeus." Worried, she retraced her steps. "Where are you, Thaddeus?" "Thaddeus is here. Thaddeus is here." With relief, she watched as he wandered toward her from the underbelly of a tree. "Thaddeus, you can't just roam around free like that," she said worriedly. The bird appeared to be completely unconcerned. "Don't you know it's dangerous for you to be out here alone?" He stopped and stared at her. "Thaddeus, up. Thaddeus, up." She frowned. Normally he didn't request to come on her shoulder, he just flew up. She patted her shoulder, and he opened his wings. But he didn't seem able to hop. Startled, worried, she walked toward him and scooped him up. That was when she saw the blood on his foot. "What have you done?" She wasn't sure what he got caught in, but something small had ripped his skin. Cooing to him gently, she turned and walked toward Muggs and Goliath. "It's just a little scratch. You should be okay." As she wandered toward Nan's, Thaddeus gently cooed along Doreen's neck and brushed against her cheek. She smiled and reached up to stroke him. "I wasn't so sure about having you originally, but I'm really glad you're part of my family now," she said in a low voice, kissing his shoulder. As if he understood, he dropped his head against her cheek and just held it there for a long moment. With a happy sigh and feeling more contentment than she had all day, she walked the last block toward Nan's place. As they approached, Nan was already seated outside on the patio, waiting for them. Muggs barked and raced across the grass. Doreen winced. She'd been told many times by the rude gardener here how she was not to walk on the grass. But no stepping stones or even a walking path led to Nan's corner apartment, so Doreen had to cross on the grass. The only way for her to avoid it was to walk all the way to the front of the complex and enter the building, where no animals were allowed. She shrugged and once again did what she was told not to do and stepped on the grass. But she did it just as fast as she could. Before long, she was seated at the little bistro of a table Nan had. She smiled as her grandmother joyously welcomed a big greeting from both Goliath and Muggs. Nan looked over at Doreen and beamed. "I think it's the best thing ever that you moved to town, my dear. That's just so you can keep your pets close." Nan chuckled. "Well, I certainly have lots of friends here. At my age, this is a lovely place to be. The house was getting to be a bit too much work. I do miss the animals, though." She reached across the table with a tiny bit of bread in her fingers. "Thaddeus, are you hungry?" Thaddeus hopped off Doreen's shoulder and waddled across the table. Nan immediately noticed the blood. "Oh dear, what did he do?" "I'm not sure," Doreen said. "He went into the underbrush when we were on the path. When he came back out, he had this scratch on his skin there." Nan sighed. "He does think he's a dog and should be allowed to go wherever he wants. And Goliath thinks he's people, and Muggs thinks he's the king of the pack," Doreen finished for her grandmother with a laugh. "That's all right. They've become a family for me, and I appreciate that." With a smile of satisfaction, Nan sat back. "Good," she said firmly. "That's what you need." "I really appreciate you giving me a place to stay," Doreen said. "I am having trouble with the stove, though." Nan looked at her with a frown. "What kind of trouble?" Doreen shrugged. She didn't want to say too much. Nan knew Doreen couldn't cook, but that didn't mean she understood the depths of Doreen's ignorance. "Couldn't get it to light." Nan nodded sagely. "It could be fussy." "That's not what I call it," she said with a smirk. "I think it's a little more than that. Mac said that I need to get it checked out before trying to use it again. If you have to, you can always get a second-hand stove." But she must have seen Doreen's grimace at the mention of buying anything because Nan leaned forward and said, "Are you out of money again?" "That's not fair," Doreen said. "There's no again about it. I haven't made any money since I arrived, remember? But after all that mess last week, I doubt anybody wants to hire me. Instead of blending in, I've become infamous," she said, like it was a joke. The trouble was, there was a lot of truth to that statement. It wasn't what she had intended. But it was what had happened. Nan waved her hand in a dismissive gesture. "Don't you worry about those folks. You've done the town a huge service. Just look at all the murders you've solved." Doreen smiled. "Well, it's nice to contribute in some way. But I wish there had been a monetary reward for it. And no, I didn't do it to get a reward. But the money would have come in handy." "What about the clothing you took to the consignment store? Did you ever talk to Wendy, see what is selling?" Doreen shook her head. "It was on my list to do today, and I completely forgot about it. I've been working on that old fence at the creek," she said on a laugh. "I never got around to calling her." Nan stared at her. "You took down the whole fence?" Doreen shook her head. "You know, the one neighbor has a really nice fence, and there was that old fence on the property on the left side. So I decided I didn't want the fence along the back blocking the creek because it really was broken and ugly looking. And that one side fence wasn't necessary with the neighbor's nice new fence." Nan laughed at that. "No doubt the place needs some work. But you won't be able to do it all yourself," she warned. "I know." Mac stopped by. Then he helped me pull up the big iron stakes from the back corner. She picked up her teacup and took a sip. When silence fell across the table, she glanced at Nan, drawing her eyebrows together. "Are you okay?" She studied the odd look on Nan's face. Then suddenly her grandmother's face cleared, and she smiled a bright sunny smile. Of course I'm okay. I think it's delightful that Mac came to help. He didn't come to help, Doreen said firmly. I'm to do some gardening at his mother's place. So he came to talk to me about that job. Nan's face lit up in delight. Well, that would be wonderful. That's something you've always loved to do, and could be a way to make money. Doreen nodded. It's just they need to pay me. I was thinking I could get a job at the gardening center when it opens up. And I could put in a good word for you. Isabel runs that place, and her grandpa Joshua, he's here with me. Doreen studied Nan for a long moment. What do you mean, he's here with you? She asked delicately. Nan looked surprised and then burst out into bright laughter. Well, he's not with me, silly. She laughed again. I mean, he lives here at this residence with everybody else. He's much older than I am. I think he's at least 88. It was all Doreen could do to hide her smile as she heard that. Nan was going on 75. To think anybody in the retirement age category was much older, it was cute. Well, that might be a good thing then. If you get a chance to say something, I'd appreciate it, Doreen said as she took another sip of her tea and sighed happily. My life is so much different now. Good, Nan said firmly. It needed to be different. You were just a shell of a woman back then. Nan had said many things like that before. Most of the time Doreen had brushed it off. But she was starting to understand what Nan meant. Back when Doreen was married, she wasn't allowed to have any of her own thoughts. She couldn't put forth any suggestions as to what to do or how to solve a problem, and anything she did say, her ex-husband would toss off as being ludicrous. It had really demoralized her to realize she had nothing of value to contribute. He hadn't wanted her to contribute. That had been part of the problem. He'd been all about being the lord of the house, and everybody else was below him. He also was a sexist, and women were good for very few things. Unfortunately for her, Doreen's self-confidence had quietly eroded with the constant criticisms over the way she dressed, or the fact she hadn't done her nails properly, or that she didn't look as well presented as somebody else's wife. And if she opened her mouth about anything business-oriented, he'd mock her. It had been a struggle to maintain appearances yet be quiet, just the way he wanted her to be. She'd presented this pretty face to the outside world, but inside her had been nothing. Nan was right. Doreen had been a walking shell.